this is the place where we share our knowledge, ask our questions and get tips and tricks all about the lapidary art. For sure, this will going to be another informative and interactive session. Erika, we're going to add more nuggets on the silversmithing process part 2. And you can also ask your questions later by raising your virtual hand by going into the reactions icon and click raise hand. Or you can also put your question in the chat and we can queue them for Erika or for John and Sherman. So everybody is excited. Let's kick off our 11th Highland Park Live Interactive webinar with our intro video.
All right, everybody, let's get us pinned up here. John, Erika, and myself. And welcome everybody here. There's also a link. We just put a link on the Nermeen put a link up there for the YouTube video for last week. Let's just cover just briefly. Let's talk through. I know you put it in the chat here, Erika, but let's just kind of give an overview for the new people that were here, what was covered so they know what to go find, go back and reference in the videos when we did last week.
Okay, so last week we covered strengths of solder. We covered choosing the bezel height, choosing the stone, soldering the bezel. I did a couple little stamping tricks. I can't quite remember.
Actually, we did. We're going to do stamping this week. The first thing we've got coming up, I think, is stamping.
We've got stamping tonight, which a lot of silversmiths struggle with. It's just one, but we'll get into that.
And she's got a super cool technique that I have never seen before about stamping, which I'm like, that's badass.
But it was just basically an introduction of myself last week. What we were going to tackle, we're tackling a really simple split shank ring, clean bezel. We covered pickle, just basic stuff. Now we're kind of getting.
And by the way, if all these words for the new people that are here, if you don't know these words, don't worry. We defined them in the previous video, so you're going to get the language. Because part of the challenge of learning a new area, I'm not silversmith, so for me, I'm learning here with you, Erika, and just understanding the language. I'm like, oh, that's what that is. That's what it is. So that's super helpful.
It's not a basil. It's a bezel.
Bezel. Yeah, unless you're from Southwestern Ohio like me, I'm going to pronounce it differently.
Unless you're cooking, right?
There you go. All right. So did we have any questions or anything that we wanted to touch on before we jump into the next video, which is your whole stamping, the stamping stuff? And we got more people coming here as well. We may actually give it a couple minutes before we roll, because I know people are plowing in right now. So just for the background, we talked about a little bit of your background getting into silversmithing. If you think about a new person coming in, Erika, from start to doing their first piece, what could somebody expect in terms of how long it would take for them to be able to do their first simple piece, maybe a simple bezel, how difficult would that to be? Because everybody kind of is like, oh, silversmithing, I don't know. Like I have a lot of lapidary people and they cut, but a lot of them are nervous about doing silversmithing.
I think there's two questions to that, or two answers to that question. And Erika, you can speak to this, that if you have somebody like Erika showing you the technique and showing you the guidance, it's a way faster than if you're just doing it on your own.
Amen. Yeah, I learned everything on my own. I mean, there were, when I started, a few videos on YouTube, and I got the gist of what I needed to do, but there were no specifics per se. That it was just kind of, oh, okay, I need solder. Okay, well, what the hell is that? Like, you know what I mean? There weren't explanations of what I needed. And so I just kind of winged it and figured it all out. But now that there's more instruction out there, and you can take silversmithing classes, you can find more videos on YouTube. If you give it the time and make it more of like something you really want to tackle, not just a hobby you want to dabble in. If you denote like a whole Saturday to it, you can do it pretty quickly.
Right.
I mean, as long as you give it the time that it deserves and expect mistakes and botch a bunch of burn stuff and break stones. I mean, you can't, like I said last week, you can't expect to be perfect right out of the gate. You're gonna melt a lot of stuff. You're gonna break stones and whack yourself on the thumb with a hammer. But it's all part of it. And then at the end, when you're finally getting the hang of it and you're learning all the bits and everything, it's like, dang, you look back and it's like, wow, it was a long road, but once, it's like riding a bike. Once you've got it, you've got it.
Well, and I imagine though, like videos like this or doing classes, it shortens that road quite a bit, because you'd taken the path of kind of figuring it out on your own for the most part, right? Other than a little bit.
Yep, all of it. Yep.
So this, like, if you'd found you when you're starting, big shortcut on some of the essentials, like what to buy and what not to buy. Like we covered tools last week about what are the basic tools to get started, and you estimated like you probably get started for under $200 for the basics.
Yep, minus the silver. I mean, and I even hit on last week, what I look back now at what I started with: the file, the nasty harsh file, sandpaper, a pair of scissors, a big old torch, a pair of pliers, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And I was able to at least get started. And then when I would look through the catalogs and see the tools, that's when it was like, oh man, that would make my life easier. That would make my life easier.
Yeah, when people are getting into lapidary, we also always recommend that they start incrementally to figure out the things they really want to do. Like, what's the right machine before you just flail at machines, because you waste money. Our team is always going to ask you, so what are you trying to do? What are you looking to accomplish? What does that look like? Because we want you to be successful. Like, I'd rather somebody get the first machine, really be successful, and then build from that, because we look to have customers for life. And although we're not perfect, like, we're always trying to understand so that we can help people make the right decisions, and then supplement that with knowledge, like giving people knowledge on how do you make a really beautiful polish on a chariote sphere. There's technique around that, which is a lot that we get into, not just the tools, but since we ship between 1 and 2 ton of rock a week in our Philippine factory before the COVID shut down. I mean, we're cutting a lot of spheres, a lot of cabs, body jewelry, things like that. And you learn things. We don't do silversmithing in that operation there. So, so Rick was saying the right flux was the moment for me. Rick had just a question here, and he says, I got easy, medium, and hard solder in 20G, and it seems very hard to melt and get to run together. The solder wire I got seems hard. I mean, generally, you're actually using those different grades of solder in different areas of your piece, correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, he got 20 gauge. That is pretty thick for solder.
Right.
I use a little bit thinner. I wish I had all my information, but if he reaches out to me, 20 gauge is pretty thick for wire solder, not gonna lie.
Yep.
That's more for the thicker wire is not, the thicker wire solder is for the people who put it in their little clippers and chase it. You know, you got your long wire sticking out from here and you chase it with the flame. That way it doesn't melt as fast and go. Whereas when I chop up my solder to put inside my bezel, it's thin. It's really
and we have a video of that coming up, I believe.
Okay, yeah.
Unless we did that already. I think it's actually coming up though.
No, it's coming up.
Well, shall we jump to the videos?
Sure.
Let's go ahead and roll the first one.
Okay, so let me go share. I'm going to optimize it for video. And by the way, if you're watching the video and you're having a hard time seeing the video, like the video, you might want to just turn your camera off while we're running the video. And that's going to give your internet a little bit better bandwidth. And sometimes that will improve your picture quality. So I'm going to go ahead and roll here. And can you all see it?
I've actually decided I'm going to stamp something on the back of this back plate towards the back of the stone. Obviously, when you've got the ring on your finger, you're not going to be able to see it, but I'll know it's there. So what I do is I flip my bezel over and I make kind of like a rough little sketch of the bezel so I know my limitations of where I can stamp. And now we're gonna go down to my stamping room. People ask me all the time, Erika, how do you stamp so straight? And my answer's the same every time. Practice, practice, practice. That's really, and have your silver as shiny as you possibly can, because when you're putting that stamp down on that silver, okay. So one of my main tricks for stamping is to have your silver as shiny as possible. I don't want to ruin my line, but I take my Pro Polish pad, or sometimes I'll even take it to my little buffing wheel to get it nice and shiny. Because if you can see the reflection of that stamp, see that reflection? If you can see the reflection of that stamp as you're placing it, you're going to be way better off stamping straight. Tip number 1. Basically, I know that my ring shank is going to go right here. My 4 prongs are going to hit somewhere in this area. So I want to stay in the lower half or the upper half. So I say we do this. Let's get a little crazy. Like I said, you want it to be super shiny. We're going to do this. We're going to go.
And I'm sorry that I'm covering this here, but
B.
it's hard to.
I get really close, so I'm probably blocking your guys' view of this video. E. Flatten it out a little bit. And then down here at the bottom, we're gonna go B. Oh. Now I'm not gonna name the brand of stamps that I use, because that is probably taboo. But if you buy crappy stamps, you're probably gonna stamp crappy. The higher quality stamps you use, like these for instance, see how that this brand shaves the metal all the way down to the letter, whereas these Harbor Freight ones, look at all that space you've got from the letter or the number all the way out to the edge, and it's always a guessing game. Whereas this brand, they shave it right down to pretty much the same shape as the letter, so it's not such a big guessing game. So we're gonna be bold.
So that's a steel plate you're stamping on, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that people struggle with when they first start stamping is bouncing. I always suggest I don't use a typical brass head hammer when I stamp. People think the heavier the hammer, the better you're going to stamp. That's false. I like to use one that's smaller and 20 ounces. That's all I use. But yeah, the thing I'm stamping on is one of those old railroad grade. The thing weighs probably 80 pounds. It's about 3 inches thick, 3/4 of a foot in diameter. It takes the blow. So if you've got your little bench block and your leather or whatever to absorb some of the vibration, that will absorb some of it so your stamp is not bouncing. But the more heavier piece of a lot of people use a stump. They put their bench block up down on a little stump or on a big stump, and that absorbs the vibration too, because bouncing is one of the things that's just, it turns people off from stamping. But if you can eliminate all those little things right out of the gate and have a big old bench block and a heavy stump or something that's not going to vibrate, you're going to be better off when you first start.
We could easily do 3-inch bench blocks. I mean, it's like laser cut that sucker.
Yeah, if someone would make them a 3-inch, 2-inch thick round, it was an antique I got from my dad. It was an old railroad. You know those big old things on the railroad? Well, it was sliced up. And there goes the cat. Sorry.
Yeah. So Lizelle, just make a note on the stamp thing, just as an idea. So I noticed that that reflection there was really cool, because that was a new thing for me, like polishing. So you can literally see where that position of that stamp is on the reflection, so you can get your positioning correctly. I hadn't seen that before, and that may be commonly known, but I was like, that's cool.
And it's funny because some people, when they're stamping, my older sister, I helped her learn how to stamp too back in the day when I couldn't handle the load of all the orders, but she would always stamp behind. She would stamp looking at the stamp from the backside. I'm the complete opposite, and I do my lapidary work the same way. I am up and over, looking over the stamp onto the silver, but some people prefer to stamp behind it and place it down and look this way. I just think you can get more accurate if you look over it. Right.
Now, a bunch of people wondering, what kind of stamp brands are those cool stamp brands that you didn't want to tell people where you got them? But they're all like, oh, where's that stamp brand? Because that was cool, where it's shaved down and it's easy to get at it.
Yeah, they're an amazing company. They're called Infinity Stamps. They're out of Long Beach. I somehow found them a long time ago, back in 07, 08, because all the fonts that I use in all my stamping are custom fonts that I specifically asked them to make for me. And back in the day, they were really expensive. But now, because stamping has become more mainstream and there's more people doing it, the cost is not as brutal as it was back then. And they have a lot of stock fonts too that are made just as well, that they keep in stock. I just like doing custom fonts because they're fonts that nobody else has.
Right. And that's part of your brand, is you're really choosing that to kind of that overall feeling of your pieces to make them unique.
But there's lots of good stamping companies out there. I mean, I just like their high-end stamps because they're just made with precision.
Right. One of the questions that somebody had here was, do you heat the metal first before stamping, or you do that afterwards? Preparing it for soldering is my question, if my question makes sense. That was a question that Heather was asking. And I think in this case, you didn't do any prep work to it. You just took it, you cut it out, you stamped it, and then we're going to go into soldering next.
You don't really, I mean, sheet silver typically comes dead soft anyways, so you're not, you know, if the metal is too soft and you hit it too hard, you might even blow through it. It doesn't, the hardness doesn't really, I mean, those are stainless steel stamps that, you know, that you're hitting on silver. So if you have too soft a silver, you run the risk of really going through it. And in fact, somebody asked me this week about stamping the outside of a bezel. You know, you got your bezel and then the outside surface. He wanted to put a bunch of stamping along that. And he goes, what gauge of silver should I use for my back plate? And I said, well, if you're going to stamp it to high heavens, you should probably start with a thicker back plate, because once you go stamping around there and you make all those little sections so condensed, it's going to get sharp, you know?
Yeah.
And
the risk for cutting, especially if that's embellished on the outside of where you're mounting the bezel.
Right. So stamping is stamping like 26 gauge, you know, the thinner you go, it's going to be too, I like to stamp thicker metal. Let's just put it that way.
Right. I got you. One of the other questions somebody had was about the micro torches that we showed last week, those little torch that you said it was a good torch to start with. I know you have an oxyacetylene or something now, right?
Yeah, I have an oxyacetylene now, but one of these little micro torches is plenty. And they make better ones now. They're called, I think Courtney told me they're called big shots. They hold more butane. You know, you just fill them up. You can get one of these in the kitchen store or whatever for creme brulee, you know.
Yep.
But like when I first started, it was kind of shady because I started with one of those big benzomatic torches and I just torched the whole piece, burnt the whole piece. So the smaller the flame, the more control you have.
Right.
And that's why a lot of people like to move over to acetylene or, you know, propane, where you can really dial in that flame and get it really hot, even though it's tiny.
Right.
So
One of the questions
Bruce is asking a question about, do you stamp before soldering the bezel? Is there instances where you would stamp after versus before?
Well, if you're looking to stamp on the back side of a bezel, if you're wanting a whole bunch of words and everything, or if you solder your bezel on that back plate and then you want to stamp it, what are you going to do? Flip it over on your bench block and stamp it? You're going to crush your bezel, unless you are stamping something small, like a small design stamp. Then you can one of these guys, one of these, you know, the rounding dapping blocks. Stick this in your vise. And then you've got a little, you know, you've got a smaller surface of a stamp, you know, of a bench block, but then you're running the risk of it moving and bouncing. Right. So I like to do all that stamping work before I even take fire to it.
But if you're doing stamping on the front, so the front side outside of the bezel, then you would do that post the solder, right? Or would you do it before and just use your line as your guide? Because you kind of lined out where the line of where that's going to be soldered.
A lot of people do it before they take fire to it because, but some people do it the other way too. They want to get that bezel down. They want to know how much room they've got to fart around with, you know, and it's more comfortable for them to be accurate if they get that bezel down first.
Right.
It's a preference thing. Try it one way. If you screw it up, then try it the other way. It might be your way.
Right. Cole had a question. How do you figure out exactly where to stamp, and specifically like rules about how far from the edge you'd want to be stamping? I guess there's a question of whether it's the stamps are on the bottom, reading from the bottom, or whether it's decorative stamping from the top, or, you know, lettering on the top around the outside.
A rule about how far from the edge. I don't know. meaning from the edge of the actual bezel that the stone goes in to the outside of the back plate? I guess.
Yeah,
I'm
Cole,
kind
maybe you put clarification in the chat about what you mean by that.
Oh, okay. So he says that's not what I was talking about. I've found if stamping before the back plate, it can bend. You mean the silver can bend? That's when you take your rawhide hammer and you get it on your bench block and you just make sure that it's all nice and even again. You can flatten that back out without hurting your stamped letters.
Right.
But
Because I
maybe-
saw you did that. You stamped and you went back, and then after you did the B, you went back and bump, 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 flattened it out, as you said.
Because it tends to concave a little bit. When you every
Right.
time you whack it, it's going to come up.
Right. If there were stamps I could use on my lapidary rocks, it'd be awesome and still having the engraving. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rocks don't take that well to like impact. But I like the idea, Richard. Do you want to roll the next video? This is getting into fire staining and then also soldering.
Yep. Roll the next one.
All right.
All right. So even though, what the hell? Even though this is not the side I'm soldering my backplate to, I still want to protect it from fire stain. Fire stain is the bane of every silversmith's existence. And to protect your piece from fire stain, you can coat it with boric acid and alcohol. I use this stuff that I got from a company on here it's meant to see all that white stuff. It's basically just flux. Protects it from that oxygen. I hate fire stain, and you will hate it too. So I'm just trying to do a preventative measure. But then you flip it over, and I have to keep my bezel confined. Hold on. Gotta keep that bezel. Gotta keep those letters. Trying to center my letters that I just stamped to the ring. All right. Again, as I said earlier, I'm not a fan of spray flux for when I'm actually putting my bezel down on my plate. I just like the handy flux. Then I just set my bezel down on my back plate. Some people like to use tripods when they solder so that they can heat from underneath. I've never been good at that, so I just choose to do it this way. This is a porcelain solder board. Sometimes I use just the old crusty kind. If it's a really, really big piece, I use charcoal because charcoal will trap that heat. But for this one, I'm just gonna use this. All right. One thing I do like to do before I lay my solder down is I like to burn off some of the moisture, because if you put solder down when it's all wet and bubbly, your solder is just gonna go flying everywhere. So I like to get rid of some of the moisture before I lay my medium solder.
All right. So so that was kind of your prep in that. Do we have questions on this? Should you throw away flux after its expiration, or does it still work after the expiration date? That's a good question.
I was just, so I don't know how old this is, but a lot of times I'll leave the cap off and it's pasty, so it dries out. But you can just water it with water and stir it up with the end of a screwdriver and you're good to go. I don't know about expired I burn through so much flux. I wouldn't even know how.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I know some of the flux that I'm doing silver soldering of tips. I have solder, but I don't even know that it has an expiration date on it.
Yeah, I mean, if you leave it out in the sun and it gets baked, yeah, you probably want to get some new stuff, but
Right.
it's not medicine, so I don't think it can really expire. Maybe I'm wrong.
Now I noted one question I had. So you had that chunk of charcoal. I mean, that like wood. So you said if you've got a piece that requires to keep hot, can you talk a little bit about that? Because that, I mean, I know you're thinking about the type of pieces. So can you give people some parameters around how do they think about the kind of environment that, you know, and whether they need to retain heat in the piece?
If you're soldering a huge statement piece, like this piece I'm wearing, you know, it's big, it's 2 inches wide. You do want to, you can get away with doing it on a solder board. Like I've got the Holy solder board, but using charcoal on bigger pieces is better because it gets hot and it's just like a barbecue. It holds that heat so that you're not constantly chasing and chasing and chasing. It tends to hold the heat, and you'll quickly learn that when you go to make a small piece on a charcoal block and you melt it completely to ribbons. Right. I don't use charcoal for everything, only pieces that require a lot of heat. And because you can only go so fast with your torch and be successful getting it nice and hot. And so that charcoal traps that heat. So you're not.
Well, and you just said something important there, which we'll see in the next video, is that constant movement, not just leaving your torch stationary. Bad things happen when you stay stationary.
Well, your goal is, or what you're trying to do is heat the whole piece. Fine, you only want to maybe get solder on that bezel or whatever, but if you don't heat the whole piece and you just direct the flame right at where you think you're going to burn it.
Right.
It's got to be an even heat. Even if you're trying to do something way down here, you have to heat that whole piece.
Okay. I just saw clarification from Cole on his question. So he says, I guess my question is, how close can you stamp to the edge of the bezel before it gets damaged or becomes hard to read? Should I try to leave a space of a certain number of millimeters? And Cole, I'm assuming in this case, you're talking about from stamps outside the bezel versus a stamp on the back, because it's going to be probably a little bit different.
How close you can stamp to the edge? Well, I see what his question is. Okay, so when we get further along and you see me actually cutting out the whole bezel and I get the back, you know, I get the whole bezel done, you can, I mean, you only have so far. So if you do go past the certain point, you're going to have a lip on that bezel. You can make it however there is no rule to anything like that. That's a total artistry thing. I've done it really close to the edge. I've done it in the center. I mean, there's no rule on that one.
Right. Okay. All right. Good. Hopefully that answers your question, Cole. Heather, I think it was Heather, asked a question, or no, Kelly asked a question, the heat sink concept. This is kind of coming back to that, when you use that. In your case, you're saying, I got a big piece, I got to keep it hot because it's going to soak up as much heat fast, and you'd have to be running that torch. So you want to keep it in a hotter environment.
The charcoal is going to hold your heat. So it's actually doing the opposite of heat sink. It's holding the heat.
Yeah, the charcoal is not a heat sink. I mean, look at it. This thing is so crusty. I mean, it burns. It starts stinking in here when I use charcoal. It's stinky because it burns like it does in the barbecue. It's not, I mean, it's kind of the same, but a heat sink is the absolute opposite. So sometimes when I'm using these little tweezers and I'm putting my ring on my ring band onto my bezel, this whole piece of metal is a heat sink. It's gonna start sucking that heat away from where I actually want it. So to avoid it being a heat sink, you kind of got to heat it up too a little bit. You know, you got to remember that it's going to take you longer to solder something if you've got it clamped, or, you know, a lot of people use third fingers to pull the pieces, these little, you know, roach clips.
Yep.
But you always have to be mindful if there's metal holding something that you're trying to solder. A lot of people use twining wire to hold stuff together. That's good because it's thin, and even though it has strength, it doesn't suck that heat from the piece you're trying to solder. Yeah,
Right.
we should talk more about that sometime.
Yep. And one of the questions that Meemaw, you asked about the ideal gauge of the bezel for backplate. We actually covered that in the previous video. I think you were using, this is like what gauge is this particular backplate?
I'm using 24.
24. But I know some things you want to do thicker depending on the size and what's happening to reduce the likelihood of it being sharp. Like a thinner could be more dangerous, especially if you're bringing outside of the bezel, you got a lot of ornaments that can be actually less strong.
Yeah, and if you have a big lip around a bezel, it depends on the piece. I mean, necklaces you can kind of get away with a thinner because it's not getting banged around and like a rings.
Yeah,
I like using thicker backplate on my rings because they get beat up. And the more you go putting on them on the outside, you want it to be able to hold that up. So if it does get whacked in a doorway, it's not going to break your finger or bend or, you know, stuff. You don't want stuff falling off. And that was a hard one for me to learn when I first started figuring that out. But once you start using different gauges of backplate and bezel wire, and it all just sort of makes sense almost overnight.
Yeah. Well, cool. Shall we go to the next video? This is getting into soldering.
Yeah, go ahead.
Share.
Also, for inside my bezels, when I'm soldering my bezel to my backplate, I like using wire solder because it fits nicely inside. When I'm soldering other things, other components, I like using sheet, and I just cut off little pallions. All right, let's do this. So I just take my little tweezers and I lay it around the edge. You don't need a whole bunch. This is relatively thicker gauge wire solder. So, and I also like having my soldering board on a rotating Lazy Susan type thing, so that when I'm soldering and I'm pulling that solder and going around and around and around, I can see it. All right, now that I got my solder all laid out, that should be enough. All right, let's tackle this baby. All right, I put it on a different angle because I like, when I heat it up, I like chasing it around the outside so I know it's come back to the outside. You'll see the solder start flowing, and then I pull the flame to the outside, because solder always follows flame. Some people swear by soldering from the bottom, but I feel like I don't have as much control that way. Here we go. See, I'm going to bring it to the outside. And then chases it to the outside, and it'll just follow that flame along the outside. Come on, baby. See it? There it goes. Like I said, this is a relatively large back plate, so I probably should have done it on charcoal to retain some of the heat. But we're being bold today. There it goes. All right, now we got our back plate. We got our bezel soldered to our back plate. We got it all soldered. I checked all the seams. You can do it by putting a light. You put a light to the outside and you check and make sure it's sealed all the way around. Not the cleanest soldering job, but it's kind of hard to do clean work when I'm having to video everything.
All right. So,
Okay, yeah, before we, I probably should have soldered that on a charcoal block because it shouldn't have taken me that long to get that solder to flow. Also, my pickle was dirty, which you'll learn, you can watch the video from last week. I had dirty pickle. So I was struggling that day with my solder to flow, but hindsight 2020, I should have just used my charcoal. It would have flown a lot faster.
right, because your heat was going out and so you couldn't keep that, you know, that hit that melting point so it would go and flow.
Yeah, so, but because what I wanted to show in that video, which I don't think I actually did because the lighting was stupid. But when I heat that piece up and get that solder melting, and as soon as I see that solder melting, I take my flame and I go to the outside of the bezel and watch it come out to, yeah, because solder follows flame. Wherever that flame is, that's where the solder's gonna go. And that's why I like having a Lazy Susan soldering station, so I can chase it all the way around and make sure that it comes all the way around.
Right.
I hope that's not confusing.
No, I mean, if people have questions, certainly ask about that. We do have some questions right now. Mimi, love Mimi, long time. I was asking, what are you guys got to put your real names on your iPhones. We got iPhone in here too. What are your feelings using solder paste versus soldering wire?
So soldering paste, I used solder paste when I first started because, and some people use it as like a little additional tool. My friend Courtney, she likes to use it when she's putting balls, you know, little teeny tiny balls as embellishments. She likes to put a little bit of the solder paste on there because it's kind of like a little glue almost.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know. Some people use solely solder paste to do all their soldering, and I just don't know how they do it. I used to use this a lot when I was working with a lot of PMC, which is precious metal clay back in the day. But now that I started using pallions and sheet solder and wire solder, I want to say it's stronger, but maybe that's just a farce. I don't know. To me, it seems using sheet and wire is more sturdy. I don't know. But easy paste, but paste solder is a lot easier because you can literally squirt it wherever you want it, and you don't have to worry about flux because it has flux in it.
It's built in, and then you're basically just putting heat to it.
Yep.
Danny was asking, how do you anneal sterling half round wire? I bought it hard and it really won't bend.
You got to anneal ring bands, and I think we do that further down the line here. Some people put Sharpie on there. They cover whatever they're trying to anneal with Sharpie, and as soon as you get that heat going and you see that Sharpie disappearing, then you know that it's hot enough. What I do is I kill all the lights and all my little, my lights around my soldering block, and I just get that and I can tell just from experience, it gets cherry red right before, if you continue to hold it on there while it's cherry red, you're going to burn it. You're going to melt it. So you got to
Right.
get it right to that cherry red stage and then let go. And
Right.
then the best thing with annealing, don't quench it right away in water. Let it air cool for, maybe 5 minutes before you go dunking it in your water, because that also helps it anneal. If you just get it nice and cherry red hot and throw it in your water and quench it, you're kind of missing out on a kind of an important step. I mean, some people don't do that. Some people just quench it right away and start hammering.
Right.
But I've learned through trial and error, it helps if you let it air cool just
Yep.
for a little bit longer.
Yep. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Madison was saying like 20 gauge backplate for rings or even thicker. I think you've been saying, yes, probably thicker depending on the intricacy.
Yeah, but like for this ring, I use 24 because
Yeah.
it's just a clean basic bezel. It doesn't have any stuff on the outside. It's not
Right.
holding weight. It's fine. It's nice and big,
Mhm.
but there's nothing that I need that's super important to have that thick of backplate.
Somebody asked, Aaron had said, hey, have you ever used volcanic rock like you use from a barbecue for your
I guess that would work.
maybe.
I'm assuming that would. The only other thing I've ever used is these stuff, these soldering blocks. I think they're made out of,
Fire brick.
Yeah, it's just fire, like what's inside a kiln.
Mm-hmm. Yep, fire brick.
And these are kind of nice too, because they hold heat a little bit better. I will admit that. And they're soft. So when you're trying to, solder a jump ring on the top of a pendant, you can kind of push it down in there, and you can use this kind of as a little tool because it's soft enough that you can dig holes in it.
Yeah, and then JP had said, is there a way to tell if the flame heat is best for soldering from its color? Do some flame colors reduce fire scale oxidation? That probably also depends on the fuel too, right?
That's a great question.
Mhm.
I know with acetylene, and all I've ever used is acetylene and butane, and they kind of behave the same. You've got that here. I'll show you. You've got that. The tip of the flame is where you'll be able to see the hottest part of your flame. And the one thing about these small little torches is it comes with like several different tips. So you can get a teeny tiny flame to just do a simple jump ring, and you don't have to heat your whole piece.
Mhm.
But I know his question. And as far as fire stain is concerned, someone once told me, and I wouldn't know from experience because I've never used it. Someone said propane doesn't create as much fire stain as acetylene or butane. But again, I've never used it, so I can't attest to that.
Right. Okay. Well, let's go to the next thing where you're cutting out the basil.
Okay.
All right, time to saw this baby out. See how many saw blades I can break. I'm making this just a clean bezel, so I don't need to follow a line or anything. I just want to follow the bezel all the way around. And when you're sawing, it's easier to turn the piece you're working with instead of trying to move your saw around. And this doesn't have to be all perfect either, because you're gonna sand it and file it and clean it up. You want to get obviously as close as you can, but I mean that's rough. But now it's time for clean up, and I gotta. Now this belt sander, like I said, this thing is so awesome. You can totally clean this bezel up with just a file. That's what I used to do up until about, I don't know, I've only had this thing like 3 months. It's like 200 bucks, something like that, 190 bucks. But you can totally do this all by hand if you want to. Also, if you have a flex shaft, I'll show you another way to do it, to get all that excess silver off. Normally what I do is I use this belt sander. I just hold it. This is crap lighting because everything's all messed up around here right now. This is one way you can do it. Another way I like to do it. Here's the other way I like to get off all that excess silver. I like taking just a sanding bit and just going all the way around it. You got a lot of control this way too. There's 1.5 million different ways to get the job done. You just have to find what's easiest, what you like better, what you like the results of, if you're going for speed, or, you know, there's 1 million different ways to finish the job. So one of the reasons why I love this bit, this sanding bit, you blow through them like gangbusters, but like this is where my solder seam was. You can really get in there and get some of that excess off, you know? And you don't have to worry about scratching everything to high heaven when you're, obviously, the less you mark up your pieces, the less cleanup you have, but I always have a ton of cleanup anyway. Sanding, that's going to be next week.
All right. That little sander is real cool that you got. That little belt
sander.
That's cool. That's
Oh,
cool little tool.
That thing is so badass. I got it from Auto Fry, and it pops right onto your rotary tool, your flex shaft. I don't know.
Yep.
I don't think it'll fit a Dremel flex shaft.
But like a Fordham or something like that?
You don't necessarily have to have a Ford. I mean, I discovered that I started using that thing so much that taking my flex shaft out of my, my hand piece and popping it in that belt sander, I thought, I'm going to wear this thing out. So I bought a knockoff rotary tool, a knockoff Fordham on Amazon for 80 bucks. And I just have that specifically for my belt sander.
Yeah. No, that's good. Let's see. We got some more questions coming in here. Let's see. Rick, when you're talking about simple CNC, like I'm assuming you're talking like, like cutting or something like that. In theory, you could do that. Certainly in the larger commercial operations, that is more the standard. Like my friends got a big factory for doing jewelry in China, and they do a lot of CNC and stamping. So it's fairly big production for long run jobs. But you'd have to have a long enough run to justify that. let's see, going down, there was a question that I got. This is actually, somebody sent it to me, but I think it's a question. It says, do you use special diamond files or standard files for like your file? And I think that was just a standard file, right, Erica? But it was fine.
Yeah. Gosh darn it. I think it used to have a number on it. It's not an aggressive file.
Very fine, Keith.
It's definitely a jeweler's file.
Yeah.
Dang nabbit. It's a Swiss made file. I just wish I knew what number, because they come in different numbers, 22, 26. I think this is a 26. Like, that's what comes to my mind, but I'm probably totally wrong. You can get some really good varieties of files that you can experience and try with different grits. It's better, in my opinion, to use finer grits because I mean, you can do a lot of damage with a file in very little time if you're not.
So especially if you're a beginner and you're learning, like, better to take more time and take less material off per pass than is something thick and you're like, shrimp, oh shit.
Yeah, exactly. So they make them really teeny tiny too, to get into really teeny tiny places. And they make different tipped files with points and squares. And so you can get into little areas that I didn't use a lot of files when I first started, though. I admit they were scary. I didn't know what the hell they were for. They were a tool that I didn't know how to use, so I stayed away from them. And then now that I'm farther into it, it's like, dang, I could use a file right now. So just with,
there was Cole had asked recommendations on flex heads for sanding. What do you use?
Like the one that I was just, we get, I think next week we get into sanding.
Okay.
And
all right. So we'll answer that question then next week, Cole.
I use a lot of different bits to sand.
Right. Madison was asking, what's the size of the saw blade they were using? I know people had asked that question last week, and I remember you'd answered it.
I think you said it was a 2/0.
Yeah, it was a 2, and there's a good chart. You can find the saw blade chart online, but because if it's true, if you use a wrong size blade for the gauge of metal, you're going to struggle. You're going to snap blades, or you're going to have a hard time getting through it. And I just find that 2 is a good round. I don't know. I have all of them. I have a million different sizes, but whenever I'm ordering, I always order 2.
Yeah.
A ton of them.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I have a question here, and this was from Danny. How do you determine how long to make your ring shank to make a given ring size when you're soldering a large backplate to it?
Oh, okay. So there's also another chart online. It's I think I got it off of Jewelry Secrets. I have it printed out and thumbtacked here.
Maybe we can get those from you, because we can post those up later as well.
Yeah.
Good reference.
It gives you the millimeters. So when someone wants a size 10, I look up at my chart and it says 62 millimeters. But I know in my mind that I always, when I'm doing these kind of split shanks, there's that area right there that's open underneath. So I deduct a little bit, or depending on how thick the wire is, if you got a super thick wire band, you got to add more, because that's going to take up that volume. There's a good formula online. If I explained it right now, I'd take up the rest of it.
Okay. So that, and then there was a question, somebody's asking, Elizabeth's asking, I've heard of folks using artificial nail filing pads for silver. Any comments on that?
One more time.
I've heard of folks using artificial nail. I assume that's for fingernails.
Yeah, I use them too.
Yeah.
These little foamy blocks, they're amazing.
Okay.
But you blow through them because they've got a good foamy. They make some good ones. Rio has a bunch. different ones with the different grits. Sometimes you only need the buffing one. Sometimes you need the coarse one. I use a lot of those.
What when you were using that sander, what grit was that the sanding drum that you had on that?
220.
Okay,
Yep.
220 there. So Vicky, that's 220 on that. Is that pretty typical when you're taking off material? You're going to use a 220?
There was a lot of material on that edge, so I can get away with 220, you know. And like I tell a lot of people, you know, people think that using a rotary tool and a spinning wheel, you're going to get out of control. But what you actually find is you have more control with a tool with a lot of speed, because you just have more control over what you're doing instead of taking a file and pushing it and then, you know, like you said, gouge the side of your bezel. It takes practice to learn how to hold your pieces when you're running a hand tool. But once you get the hang of it, you just don't know how you ever live without it. But let me tell you.
So if somebody's new to use that, would you recommend them, you know, as they get familiar using maybe like a 400, you know, like as you get familiar with how things are taken off, like I would always start with a finer grit and work my way into the coarser grit. So I learn, you know, like how fast it takes off material if somebody's brand new to it.
Well, I mean, the sanding bit, the one that I was using there, is just kind of like a shortcut. Again, just you gotta just figure. I mean, if it was an 18 gauge bezel or bezel backplate, 400 is gonna take you 10 hours to do that. So there's just different applications for different grits. I know that's a very vague, terrible answer, but just when you buy that kind of thing, when you buy those kinds of bits, buy 10 different grits, fart around with everything, because you'll eventually use them in some capacity. Yeah.
Hey, Scott asked an interesting question. He says, can I use my C8 cabbing machine to sand the sides?
Like a diamond wheel?
Yeah, well, I want to speak to that because somebody that kind of ties into the question around using the diamond files. The diamond files are really not an advantage over a standard steel file, because you're working with such soft metal that it will take you a long time to wear out a file. And the diamond files are generally, you know, like they're specific grit. Diamond cutting metal, it is not as good. Myself, the question about using the C8, most of those wheels are really not designed for cutting metal, and particularly not soft metals. I think you're not going to get the best results trying to do that.
Right.
I do know that some people do use their CB8s or their cabbing machines when they're making inlay. You know, you got that chunk of stone in the silver and you can clean it up as much as you want, but take it to that. I mean, I wouldn't do an empty bezel on a diamond wheel on my cab machine. But when you're making inlay, you go all the way down the line.
Well, in theory, like John,
if you got stone or other material involved, you'll get a better flushing than if you're just doing silver, because part of what happens with that wheel speed is you can start loading the wheel up with silver.
Right. Now, the one way somebody could perhaps use a CB8, if you had, like, when you come out with those end wheels, because I know you have those plates coming out at some point, John, then you could do a pressure sensitive adhesive silicon carbide. I mean, pop that on there. Now you got a sanding surface. Or we also have customers that use Expando wheels with silicon carbide. And that, of course, is just like your belt sounder then. Now your silicon carbide sanding belt as opposed to diamond. And it's going to work similar to like your little thing, but on the cabbing machine.
It's just hard for me to think of taking that bezel to 1 horsepower motor. It's scary.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely for particularly, I mean, okay, I could do it because I've worked with materials a long time. But if
Rick's been doing it today. Rick's I gotta confess.
Yeah. So if you're really skilled with working with materials, you can get away with a lot of stuff. It's definitely not the technique I would try and recommend a beginner to start with, because you can do a lot of damage with a big wheel.
Well, just find, like, sometimes even when I'm cutting copper fire brick or Mohawkite, stuff with, Canadian silver cabs, it'll eat your wheels so fast.
Yep.
So be mindful of that.
So just let me hear from people in the chat. Are you guys liking this discussion? Just say yes if you're like, damn, I'm getting some good stuff from here. Like Erika's just dropping them again and again and again. Our objective for you is when you're on these calls, we want you to take away with like, damn, that little piece I got there is going to shortcut my process and it's going to help me achieve my vision and my dream of what we want. I mean, that's why we do these webinars, is we want you to succeed. One of the ways that you can help us is give us a good Google review. Give us a 5-star review saying, hey, we love the webinar. We love you bringing on speakers. Like, put that up there. Give us a 5-star review. Like, we love it. And what that does is that gets us more visibility. And also you can scan that. They put a link in the chat, but also go and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've just set up another, some more videos. And I know people want to know shaping machine. People want to know sphere cutting. And I'm hopefully John's going to send me a core drill right there, John, that I can shoot some video on. Full confession, all my stuff tends to go to customers because you guys buy it faster than we can make it. So I keep losing my machines, but we want to be able to help you. So subscribe to YouTube channel, because we're going to be pumping up more very specific videos around how do I polish. Say if I got spheres and they're looking good, but I want to take it so it has that mirror finish. How do I work through a 1200, 4000, 8000, and then leather and cerium process? Or if I'm working with chrysocolla, how do I use diamond paste on canvas? We want to answer those kinds of questions for you so you can really amp up the quality of work. So definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel. And I think we posted also up your links here. You have a sale coming up, right, Erika? I thought I saw that come through the chat.
I've got at 10 o'clock Pacific. I got my sale. Yep, on Instagram. Oh my gosh!
Look, we did it for you. So check out her stuff. Even if you don't intend to buy something, go see what Erika's doing, because this can give you inspiration for your own work. I like that Vericide. That is a nice piece there. So of course, Kelly says the trick is being quick enough to grab one, because they sell fast. And by the way, Erika's doing all these things on the CB8. When Erika approached us, she's like, I want to do something on the CB8. I'm like, I'd love to do that. Let's do silversmithing first, because everybody wants to mount things. So we actually said, let's do silversmithing first, and then we'll come back to cabbing and cover that on a later time. So certainly, anything else that you want, the two of you want to cover here? We're kind of a little past the hour here. Yeah, she is a champ, Heather.
Well, I put in the chat that I think next week we'll be able to, now that, well, we didn't even get to the ring.
I got the rolling mills the next one. So you got rolling mill.
I think we've got like 2 more weeks. I'm not kidding.
We got a lot I'll tell you, we got a lot of content. Erika, you've done such a fantastic job making all these videos and bringing all this content for all the people that are viewing on the webinar. And I think, this is fantastic. And if it runs 2 more weeks, we're going to do it 2 more weeks, because we really want to be demystifying everything we can about all the lapidary and silversmithing processes.
Right.
Make it easy for people, make it easy to be successful, and kind of do the opposite of the trend of the kind of the old timers used to do, where they'd have their secrets and then they wouldn't tell anybody, and
then they would die with their secret.
Drives me
exactly.
insane.
We
man.
knew a dude that could polish anything. He was the most phenomenal tumbling guy that we had ever met in the planet. Friggin' could polish anything. If I teach you, there'll be less sales for me. And that all his wisdom, his lifetime of knowledge died and went to the grave with him. Nobody knows. No contribution. So for us,
but I can appreciate some things people keeping secret, but I mean, we're talking like basic stuff here. And when I first started, I reached out to several silversmiths. Hey, can you help me with this? No. And it's like, why? Why be a turd? Help me.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question for the people that are online here. So if you sell anything that you make, put a yes in the chat. Any of those of you here that are on that do any make things that you sell? Richard, Danny, yeah. So a bunch of people you're selling. So Cole wants to, Ron, Ross. So one of the things we're also looking to do on upcoming webinars is really digging into selling online, funnels versus websites versus social media versus Etsy, like helping you understand that whole space. Markar and I, we're very technical in terms of understanding all the systems and CRM, how to track your customer information. So that's something that is going to be coming up as well, as we'll be doing a thing on helping people learn how to sell online. We sell the bulk of a lot of our business is online. Probably 65% of our business is all online. And then Lizelle and her team certainly are the people. If you call in, you're going to talk that. But we want to teach that, because if we can help you grow your business, you're probably going to buy more stuff. And so we both win. So we want to help you do that. So give us a good review. Give us a 5-star review. And certainly we love you guys being here. Next week, schedule change. Right, John?
You're asking me. It sounds like more like you're telling me.
Yeah. So we've had a bunch of you say, please move this to Thursday from Friday, because a lot of people are Friday's a family night. So when we actually ask you guys on our survey, a lot of you are like, I want to do it on Thursday, not Friday. And so we're going to be moving the webinar here to Thursday nights, because it just seems to have free up more people on being able to do this versus on Friday. So that's going to be coming up starting next week, will be Thursday. And that works fine for you, Erika, I assume? We're not taking you out of a key thing. Good. Nope, so that's going to be a change of date. So lots of you guys said do it Thursday, like overwhelming. So we're like, okay, we're going to shift it to Thursday so we can actually make it a little bit more convenient for you. So next week, Thursday, be looking for that. And please give us reviews. Please check out Erika's website and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And Erika, of course, we thank you. You rock. You totally rock.
You guys rock. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, well, that's fine. You do wonderful work. All right, everybody, have a great night. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you next week on Thursday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.